The dry wind carried dust across the main street of the little frontier town, lifting scraps of hay and swirling them around the legs of men who had gathered near the corral. It was late afternoon, the kind of time when the sun sat low enough to make the shadows long and the air heavy with gold. The place smelled of leather, horse sweat, and old timber baking in the heat. A rough wooden sign hung outside the auction barn that read, "Cattle sale, honest prices." Folks had come from miles around. Ranchers, traders, drifters, and settlers all packed shoulder to shoulder, their eyes sharp for a good bargain. But no one expected what the farmer shouted that day. "Buy a cow, get a working Apache woman for free," he hollered from the platform, his voice cutting through the dusty hum of the crowd like a whip crack. The words turned heads, froze a few faces, and drew a hush that felt heavier than the desert air. The farmer was an old man, lean as barbed wire, with a voice that had the tone of someone used to getting attention. He stood beside a tethered milk cow, and behind it, a young Apache woman bound at the wrists with rough rope. Her dark hair caught the sunlight, and her face held no fear, only quiet defiance. The crowd didn't know what to do with itself. Some laughed awkwardly, assuming it was some cruel joke. Others nodded, thinking it just another trait of the times. A few looked away, ashamed but silent. The girl's bare feet were thick with dust, and her clothes were torn from hard work. Still, her back was straight, her chin high. She looked past the crowd as though she didn't even see them. The farmer spat into the dirt and gave the rope a tug. "She works the fields, cooks, and don't say much. Stronger than most men. Comes with the cow for whoever's got the coin. Ain't that a deal?" The laughter that followed was dry and uneasy, like something dying in the throat. That was when a stranger stepped out from the edge of the crowd. He wasn't from around there. You could tell by the way he moved, slow, sure, like a man who'd seen too much and learned to say little. He had the dust of travel on his hat, and the calm of someone who'd been alone for a long while. His boots were cracked, his duster worn, and the revolver at his hip hung easy but ready. Folks made way for him without being asked. The farmer squinted at him, trying to place his face. "You looking to buy, cowboy?" he asked. The man didn't answer right away. He just looked at the Apache woman, really looked at her. Not the way a man sizes up a trade, but as if he was trying to read something written behind her eyes. The silence stretched until even the horses stopped shifting. Finally, he said, "How'd she end up here?" His voice was quiet, but it carried. The farmer gave a sharp laugh. "How you think? Her tribe burned my fields 3 summers back. Killed my brother. She was caught sneaking round the valley after. I spared her life, put her to work, and now she's mine to sell." The cowboy's jaw tightened, a shadow passing across his face. "She's not yours," he said, so soft the words barely carried. But they did. The crowd shifted, feeling a spark of something dangerous in the air. The farmer leaned forward on the fence rail, smirking. "She's property. I got the right." The Apache woman's eyes flicked toward the cowboy then, just once. A silent question, maybe a warning. The man met her gaze, and for a moment it felt like the whole world had gone still. Someone in the back of the crowd chuckled nervously. "Ain't your business, stranger," another called out. Let the man sell his goods. But the cowboy didn't move. His hand rested near his belt, not on the gun, but close enough to remind everyone he wore one. The farmer scowled. "You got money or not?" he barked. "Ain't no one stopping this sale." The cowboy stepped closer, his boots kicking up slow clouds of dust. "Untie her," he said. The crowd stirred again. This wasn't the first time a man had stood up in that town, but it was the first time someone had done it for an Apache. The tension rolled through the air like thunder waiting to break. The farmer's face flushed red. "You got a big mouth for a drifter. Maybe you want to buy yourself a fight instead?" The cowboy didn't answer. He reached into his coat, pulled out a small pouch, and tossed it onto the ground between them. The sound of metal coins hitting dirt echoed sharp and final. "That's for the cow," he said, his voice low. "She goes free." The farmer stared at the pouch, then back at the cowboy. "You can't buy her freedom, boy. That ain't how the world works." "Maybe it should," the cowboy replied. A murmur rippled through the people. Some looked toward the sheriff's office, though no badge had shown up yet. The sun dipped lower, throwing long shadows across the barn and turning the dust red like blood. The Apache woman stood still, her eyes now locked on the man who had spoken for her. There was something unreadable in her face, gratitude, disbelief, or maybe pity. The farmer kicked the pouch with his boot, coins scattering across the dirt. "You think you can walk in here, flash silver, and play hero?" he snarled. "You don't know what you're messing with. That woman's cursed. Her people come for her and for you. The cowboy said nothing. He took another step forward. The old boards underfoot creaked. Then, without breaking his stare, he untied the rope from the fence post himself. The farmer lunged forward, but the sound of the revolver being cocked froze him in place. The cowboy didn't raise it, just held it low, steady. The Apache woman's wrists fell free. She rubbed them lightly but didn't run. She stood beside the cowboy, silent as the desert wind. The farmer's breathing grew harsh. "You're making a mistake," he spat. "You don't know what she's done." The cowboy holstered the gun. "Maybe I don't," he said, "but I know what you've done." He turned to walk away and she followed. The crowd parted, quiet now, eyes avoiding the two as they passed. No one dared stop them. When they reached the end of the main street, the sound of hooves echoed from somewhere far off. The horizon burned orange, the last of the daylight bleeding away. But before they could step beyond the town's edge, a voice called out behind them. It wasn't the farmer, it was the sheriff, his hand resting on the butt of his gun, his badge catching the dying light. "Hold up," he said calmly. "You just took property that ain't yours. Law says that's theft." The cowboy turned, the wind catching his coat. "Law's wrong," he said. The sheriff's gaze slid to the woman. "That's not for you to decide. Hand her over and I'll forget this ever happened." The street grew still again, every soul in town watching from doorways and windows. The Apache woman's hand tightened around the edge of her torn shawl. The cowboy stood his ground, jaw set, eyes dark with something old, something that wasn't just anger. The sheriff took a step closer, his boots crunching in the dirt. "Don't make me do this, son." The cowboy's hand hovered near his holster. The air was thick, waiting to explode into violence. The woman whispered something under her breath, words no one else could understand. A single crow called from the roof of the saloon. The next sound could decide who lived to see another. Sunrise. And as the wind swept through the street, carrying the smell of gunpowder and dust, everyone held their breath, waiting to see whether the cowboy would stand down or draw first. The wind howled through the narrow street as the cowboy and the Apache woman stood frozen in that tense moment. The sheriff's hand stayed close to his holster, his eyes never leaving the stranger's face. The crowd remained silent, their breaths caught somewhere between fear and curiosity. The cowboy didn't move, but there was something about his stillness that made even the sheriff hesitate. He looked like a man who had faced death before, and hadn't much cared if it came again. The Apache woman said nothing, but her presence seemed to pull the air tight around them. Her expression carried a calmness that made the tension worse, like she knew something no one else did. The sheriff shifted his stance, searching for some sign of weakness in the cowboy's eyes, but found none. The silence dragged until a creak came from the saloon door. Old man Trumbly, the barkeep, stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag. "Sheriff," he called out, voice low but clear, "best let this one be. Ain't no harm done yet." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "The law don't turn blind, Trumbly." "Maybe not," Trumbly said, nodding toward the Apache woman. "But sometimes the law don't see clear in this land either." That broke the tension just enough for the cowboy to take a slow step backward, still facing the sheriff. He gave a small nod, then turned, guiding the woman down the road toward the open plain beyond the town. No one stopped them. No one said another word, only the sound of the wind and the slow steps of two souls walking into something they both didn't yet understand. They didn't speak until the last roof of the town disappeared behind them. The sun had slipped below the ridge, and the desert was turning cold fast. The woman walked a few paces behind him, her wrist still red from the rope. When the cowboy finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "You got a name?" She didn't answer right away. She watched his back, saw the way his shoulders carried a kind of tired strength, like he'd been walking with ghosts for years. "Tessa," she said finally, her accent soft but clear. "My name is Tessa." He nodded once but didn't look back. "I'm just a drifter," he said. "Don't stay long anywhere. Then why'd you stop?" she asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he glanced toward a rocky ridge ahead. "There's a creek up there," he said. "We'll rest a while before moving on." The night came quickly, as it always did in the desert. They reached the creek just as the first stars began to show. The cowboy gathered dry wood, and she watched, curious about this man who had risked his life for her without asking anything in return. His movements were steady and sure. He built the fire with the ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. When the flames began to dance, the warmth softened the cold wind that slid through the rocks. Tessa sat on the ground near the light, rubbing her sore wrists. He noticed but said nothing, handing her a canteen instead. "Drink," he said simply. She took it and nodded in thanks. For a long while they said nothing. The fire cracked softly, and an owl called from somewhere in the distance. Then she spoke, her tone low. "He took me 2 winters ago. My village was gone by then. Soldiers burned it. I hid in the hills, but hunger. It finds everyone." The cowboy stared into the fire. "He said your people burned his fields." She looked up, her eyes dark and steady. "Maybe they did. Maybe they didn't. Men always find a reason to take what isn't theirs." He nodded slowly. "That's true." She studied him for a moment. "You've lost people too." He didn't reply, but the way his shoulders tensed told her enough. The truth sat between them without needing words. After a moment, she looked back at the fire. "You could have left me there," she said softly. "I could have," he replied. "Didn't seem right." She smiled faintly, not out of gratitude, but something else. Something like understanding. The desert wind shifted, carrying the smell of mesquite and far-off rain. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a piece of jerky, offering it to her. "Ain't much, but it'll do." She took it, eating slowly, her eyes never leaving the flames. After a while, he asked, "You got anywhere to go?" She shook her head. "No place left. My tribe scattered, some taken south, some killed. I stayed because I thought maybe someone would come back." The cowboy's gaze softened for a moment. "Ain't no one coming back," he said quietly. She nodded. "I know." The silence stretched again, this time easier than before. The kind of silence shared by 2 people who didn't need to talk to understand each other. But underneath that quiet, the unease of what waited behind them still lingered. Back in town, the sheriff stood at the corral long after dark, staring at the dirt where the coins had scattered. The farmer paced nearby, furious. "You just gonna let him go?" he barked. "That man took my worker, my property." The sheriff turned, his voice tired. "You ever think maybe she wasn't yours to begin with? She was my payment for the fire they lit." "You call that justice?" The sheriff's gaze hardened. "Ain't no justice left out here, just men trying to live with what they done. And you, old man, you've been carrying hate long enough." The farmer spat into the dust. "You'll regret this, Sheriff. You'll see. That woman ain't just some squaw. Her kind's cursed. You'll hear from her people soon enough." The sheriff didn't answer, but his eyes followed the horizon, where a thin plume of smoke still rose from somewhere deep in the desert. He had the uneasy feeling that trouble wasn't done with their town yet. By the next morning, the cowboy and Tessa were miles from the settlement. The sun rose behind them, painting the land in a pale gold. They passed through dry gullies and along ridges where only cactus and silence lived. The cowboy's horse trotted slow, the woman walking beside it without complaint. He looked down at her once. "You ride?" She shook her head. "Not since before the war." He dismounted and held the reins toward her. "Then it's time you did again." She hesitated, unsure if he was mocking her, but his face showed only quiet sincerity. Slowly, she climbed up, settling awkwardly on the saddle. He walked beside the horse, his hand steadying the reins. They traveled like that for hours, saying little, but as they went, she began to speak, not all at once, but in fragments. She told him about her brother who had led raids against soldiers, about her mother who had tried to keep peace with settlers, and about the morning the soldiers came, burning everything in their path. The cowboy listened without interruption. When she finished, she asked about him. "You have a name?" He hesitated, then said, "Most call me Clay." "Clay," she repeated, testing the sound of it. "Like the earth." "Guess that fits," he said with a faint smile. But there was something in his tone that told her he'd been called other names before, names he didn't want to remember. By late afternoon, they reached a narrow canyon with an old shack built against the rocks. It looked abandoned, but the well beside it still held water. Clay inspected it quietly, then nodded. "We'll stay here tonight." Inside, the shack smelled of dust and old timber. There was a broken table, a few rusted pans, and a cot missing its rope weave. Still, it was shelter. Tessa swept the floor with her hands, clearing a spot for the fire. When she looked up, she caught Clay watching her, not with pity, but with quiet respect. "You've lived hard," he said. "So have you," she replied. He didn't deny it. He crouched beside the fire pit, lighting the flame, and for the first time, something like peace flickered between them. But it didn't last. Out in the distance, a faint echo of hoofbeats carried through the canyon. Clay's head lifted immediately, eyes narrowing. "Riders," he muttered. Tessa froze. "From the town?" "Maybe," he said, reaching for his rifle. "Maybe worse." The sound grew clearer. 3, maybe 4 horses moving fast. The cowboy's instincts told him they weren't travelers. He looked toward the woman. "You trust me?" Her answer came without pause. "I do." He nodded once, motioning for her to get behind the shack. She disappeared into the shadows as the hoofbeats drew closer, the dust rising through the narrow canyon mouth. Clay stepped out into the open, his rifle resting easy but ready in his hands. 4 riders appeared, their faces half hidden by dust scarves. The lead man raised a hand, stopping the others. "You the drifter who took the Apache?" He called. Clay didn't answer. He just waited. The rider grinned, showing a row of yellow teeth. "Sheriff's got a bounty for bringing her back. Alive or dead. Guess which pays better?" Clay's eyes stayed cold. "You don't want this fight." The men laughed, the sound sharp against the canyon walls. "You think you can take all 4 of us?" Clay said nothing. He could feel Tessa's eyes watching from the shadows, could almost hear her heartbeat. He shifted his stance, the rifle steady in his grip. The leader spat into the dust. "Suit yourself." He raised his hand, and the riders reached for their guns. The moment hung like a drawn breath, the desert air trembling before the storm, and as the first trigger clicked, the world seemed to pause, just long enough for fate to decide who would still be standing when the dust finally settled. The first gunshot cracked through the canyon like a thunderclap. Clay dropped to one knee behind a rock, the bullet tearing through the air where his head had been. Dust exploded around him as the echo bounced off the stone walls. He fired back once, clean and steady. One of the riders cried out and fell from his horse, clutching his shoulder. The others scattered, using the rocks for cover. Horses screamed, their hooves striking stone as the narrow canyon filled with gunfire and dust. Tessa pressed herself against the back wall of the shack, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it over the shots. She'd lived through battles before, but this felt different, closer, personal. She could see Clay's silhouette through the gaps in the wood, moving with a calm that didn't make sense for a man outnumbered. He didn't waste a bullet. Every shot he took found its mark or forced the others to keep their heads down. Then came the silence. Heavy, stretched thin. The canyon waited. One of the riders tried creeping along the ridge, his boots scraping rock. Clay looked up, eyes narrowing. He fired once. The man dropped, rolling down the slope, his rifle tumbling beside him. The last 2 hesitated, unsure if the bounty was worth dying for. Clay called out, voice cold and clear. "Take your friend and go. Tell the sheriff if he wants a fight, he'll get one, but not here." For a long moment, no one moved. Then one rider dismounted, dragging the wounded man onto his horse. The other followed, glaring down at Clay before spitting into the dust. "You'll regret this, cowboy." "You and that savage both," Clay didn't reply. He just watched them ride off until their shadows disappeared into the desert. When the sound faded, he lowered his rifle and turned back toward the shack. Tessa stepped out, her hands trembling though she tried to hide it. He glanced at her, sweat and dust streaking his face. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded. "You didn't have to do that." "Didn't have much choice," he said, reloading his rifle with slow precision. "They'd have killed us both if I hadn't." She looked toward the canyon mouth where the last of the dust still hung. "They'll come back?" "Yeah," he said softly. "They will." They spent the rest of the day in silence, repairing what they could of the shack and gathering supplies. The creek nearby offered a small comfort. Fresh water, quiet running between the stones. But both knew it wouldn't last. By nightfall, a chill settled over the land. The stars came out sharp and endless above them, cold as steel. Tessa sat near the fire, her dark hair catching the light as she spoke. "You could leave me. You'd be safer." Clay shook his head. "I've done enough running in my life. This time I stay." She studied him, seeing in his eyes the same kind of loneliness she carried. "You've killed before," she said quietly. He didn't deny it. "War does that to a man." "Which war?" He poked at the fire with a stick. "Does it matter? I fought for a cause I didn't believe in. Lost people I did. Been drifting ever since." Tessa turned her gaze to the flames. "And now you fight for someone you barely know." Clay looked at her then, his voice steady. "Maybe that's reason enough." The silence between them grew heavy again, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the far-off cry of a coyote. Somewhere in the darkness, the desert shifted, alive with unseen eyes. Back in town, the sheriff sat in his dimly lit office, staring at the bounty poster on his desk. It was freshly printed, the ink still smudged. The farmer had paid to have it made, his pride and rage wrapped in the price of silver. "Wanted for theft and obstruction," it read. Reward for return, dead or alive. The sheriff sighed, rubbing his temples. He'd known Clay once years back. They'd served in the same regiment before the war had turned both men into ghosts. You're making a mistake, muttered his deputy, a young man with more temper than sense. That drifter's trouble. He shot 3 men in cold blood. The sheriff shook his head. He defended himself. I know him. He don't shoot unless he's got to. Doesn't matter, the deputy said. The farmer's stirring folks up. Says the Apache woman's cursed. Says she'll bring war back to the valley. The sheriff leaned back, eyes heavy with the kind of weariness that comes from knowing right and wrong don't always matter. Folks around here don't need a curse to do bad things, he said. They just need an excuse, the deputy frowned. You gonna go after him? Someone has to, the sheriff replied. But deep down, he wasn't sure if he was chasing Clay to bring him in, or to save him. 2 nights later, the desert wind carried the sound of horses again, but this time, it wasn't a fight. Clay and Tessa had been traveling east, toward the mountains. The land had grown harder, lonelier. Their supplies were running thin, and both could feel the weight of eyes on them, though no one had shown yet. Tessa had changed since the day he untied her. She still spoke little, but her steps carried strength again. She walked with purpose, scanning the horizon as if reading signs the earth itself whispered to her. Sometimes she stopped suddenly, crouching to touch the dirt. Someone passed through here, she'd say. 2 men. Not long ago, Clay trusted her word more than his own eyes. The desert belonged to her kind long before fences and lawmen came. That night, they found shelter in the ruins of an old mission, its walls crumbling but strong enough to keep the cold at bay. As the firelight flickered against the stone, Tessa unwrapped a small leather pouch she'd carried since the day he met her. Inside was a carved piece of bone, smoothed by age. Clay watched her turn it over in her hands. What is it? She hesitated before answering. A piece of my brother's knife. He was our war chief. They took him north after the raid. I never found him, he nodded slowly. Maybe he's still out there, she shook her head. If he were alive, I'd feel it. He said nothing, but he could see how that small piece of bone was more than memory. It was the only thing holding her together. Before dawn, she woke him suddenly, her hand on his shoulder. Someone's coming. Clay was on his feet before she finished speaking. He heard it too, the faint jingle of a spur, the creak of saddle leather. They hid behind a fallen wall as a figure appeared through the haze of morning light. It was the sheriff riding alone. He stopped near the mission, dismounted and called out softly. Clay, I know you're here. Clay stepped out, rifle lowered but ready. You come to take me in? The sheriff met his gaze, the years between them hanging heavy. You know I ain't keen on this. But there's a price on your head now. Word's spreading fast. Clay studied him. Then why ride alone? The sheriff sighed. Because I had to see for myself before the others come. They won't talk. They'll shoot. Tessa stepped out from behind the wall, her expression wary but calm. The sheriff's eyes softened. So this is her, Clay nodded. She's done nothing wrong. The sheriff looked at her a long moment before speaking. Wrong don't matter much out here anymore. Fear's louder than truth. What do you want, Sheriff? Clay asked. To warn you, he said. A band of hired men's been riding out of town. They mean to end this tonight. You can't fight 'em all, Clay. Clay's jaw tightened. Maybe not. But I won't hand her over. The sheriff glanced toward Tessa, then back at Clay. You always did find trouble worth dying for. Clay gave a faint, tired smile. Better than living for nothing? The sheriff mounted up again, pulling his hat low. I'll do what I can to slow them down. But when the sun sets, you'd best be gone. When he rode off, the desert swallowed his tracks like it never wanted to remember them. Tessa turned to Clay. You trust him? He nodded slowly. He's one of the last good men left, but he won't be able to stop what's coming. The day passed in restless silence. Clay checked his weapons, packed what little food they had, and mapped a path through the hills. But by late afternoon, dark shapes began to appear along the horizon. Riders, too many to count. Tessa watched them approach, her voice low. They won't stop, I know, Clay said. But neither will I. He handed her the rifle. You stay low. If anything happens, ride east. Don't look back. She stared at him, her eyes fierce. I won't leave you. You might have to. The first rider fired a warning shot into the sky, the sound rolling across the empty plain like thunder announcing the storm. Clay gripped his revolver, the desert sun burning behind him, dust rising like smoke between him and the coming men, and as the wind carried their shouts closer, the old mission stood silent, a grave waiting for whoever would fall first when the fight began. The sun was sinking low, turning the sky into a haze of copper and smoke. The riders fanned out across the plain, their silhouettes black against the light. Dust rose behind them, swallowing the horizon. Clay watched from the broken wall of the old mission, the rifle steady in his hands, every muscle in his body tight with waiting. He could hear the faint rattle of spurs and the thud of hooves echoing like war drums. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Beside him, Tessa crouched low, loading spare bullets into the rifle's chamber. Her hands were calm, but her eyes were distant, reflecting the kind of fear that comes not from death itself, but from knowing what it costs. The dry wind carried the smell of gun oil, sweat, and the faint trace of sage. It was the kind of stillness that came before something terrible. Clay looked out toward the riders and counted. 8 of them, he said quietly. Maybe more behind. She didn't look up. We can't stay here. No, he said, shaking his head. We make our stand here. If we run, they'll chase us till we drop. She turned to him then, her face hard in the fading light. Then we fight. He studied her for a moment. The girl he had untied from a post days ago was gone. What stood beside him now was something stronger, born from the ashes of everything she'd lost. He almost told her to leave anyway, to save herself, but he knew it would be useless. She wasn't the kind to run anymore. As the riders drew closer, the sheriff appeared on the far ridge, alone on his horse. Clay spotted him through the dust, his hat brim low, rifle slung across his back. He wasn't part of the mob, but wasn't stopping them either. He'd done all he could to delay them. Now he was just there to see how it would end. The leader of the riders, a man with a red bandana across his face, raised a hand. The others slowed to a halt, forming a wide half circle around the mission. "Clay!" he shouted. "You're outnumbered and surrounded. Hand over the woman and maybe we'll let you live." Clay called back, his voice steady. "You rode a long way for a lie," the man laughed. "Lie or not, that Apache ain't worth dying for. She's brought trouble to everyone she touches. You think you're her savior? You'll end up buried beside her." Tessa stepped beside Clay, her voice clear as glass. "You'll have to kill me first." Her words rolled across the canyon like a challenge, silencing even the wind. The men shifted uneasily in their saddles. The leader spat into the dust. "So be it." He gave the signal. The first shot came from the ridge, hitting the wall beside Clay and splintering the wood. The second tore through the doorway, showering Tessa with dust. Clay fired back, quick and precise, hitting one rider square in the leg. The man fell with a scream, his horse bolting into the desert. Chaos erupted. Bullets whined, horses bucked, and the old mission filled with the smell of gunpowder and grit. Clay moved from cover to cover, firing and reloading, never staying in one place long enough to be an easy target. Tessa stayed near the rear wall, shooting when she saw movement, her aim surprisingly sharp. The echo of each gunshot bounced off the stone ruins, multiplying the sound until it felt like a war. The sheriff stayed back on the ridge, watching, his hands clenched on the reins. He'd seen too many fights end like this, men dying for pride, for vengeance, for reasons lost before the first bullet ever flew. But this one cut deeper. He knew Clay didn't deserve to die here, and yet he knew there was no stopping what had already started. When the smoke began to clear, Clay realized they'd hit 3 of the riders, but the others were regrouping. He heard them shouting to flank around the side, voices hard with anger and greed. They were coming fast, closing in from both ends. "Back wall!" Clay shouted. Tessa grabbed the rifle and moved with him, crouching low. They broke through the rear door and ran behind the mission's crumbling corner, the earth rising steeply into the canyon slope. Clay pushed her ahead. "Climb," he said. "Get high ground." She obeyed, scaling the rocks with sure hands. Clay covered her, firing into the smoke, driving the men back for a few precious seconds. When he turned to follow, a bullet grazed his arm, burning through his sleeve. He stumbled but kept climbing, gritting his teeth as the pain bit deep. By the time he reached her, the riders were regrouping below, shouting and pointing up the slope. They couldn't climb easily on horseback, but it wouldn't stop them long. Tessa looked at Clay's bleeding arm. "You're hurt." "I've had worse," he said, tying a strip of cloth around it. His voice was rough but steady. "We hold here. They can't reach us all at once." Below, the leader barked orders. 2 men dismounted and started up the rocks, rifles ready. Clay raised his gun, waited for them to come into view, and fired. The first fell instantly. The second ducked behind a boulder, firing back wildly. The rock beside Tessa exploded, showering her with fragments. She didn't flinch. She reloaded and fired once, the shot echoing sharp and final. The man slumped forward, sliding down the slope. The others hesitated. Even the leader paused, looking up at the ridge where the two figures stood against the dying sun. For a moment, no one moved. Then the sheriff's voice rang out from the ridge. "Stop this! It's over!" The riders turned, startled. The sheriff rode forward, his rifle raised but not aimed. "You've done enough. There's no bounty worth what you'll lose here," the leader sneered. "You've gone soft, Sheriff. You think you can talk us down after letting that murderer walk?" The sheriff's voice hardened. "He's no murderer. And if you ride any closer, you'll answer to me." The leader laughed. "You gonna take on all of us?" The sheriff's horse shifted uneasily under him, the animal feeling the tension. "If I have to." For a few seconds it seemed like the words might work, that reason might win out. But then one of the younger men, nervous and eager, pulled his trigger. The shot missed the sheriff but hit his horse in the flank. The animal reared, screaming. The sheriff fell hard into the dirt as chaos broke loose again. Clay saw it happen. He swore under his breath and moved down the slope before Tessa could stop him. She reached for him, her voice breaking. "Don't!" But he was already halfway down, firing as he went. He reached the sheriff just as two riders closed in. He shot one clean through the chest and swung his rifle like a club into the other, knocking him from his saddle. Dust filled the air thick as smoke as Clay crouched beside the fallen lawman. "You all right?" The sheriff groaned, clutching his ribs. "Think so." Horse took the worst of it. He looked up at Clay, half smiling through the pain. "You never did know when to quit." "Neither did you," Clay said, pulling him to cover behind the horse's body. Tessa fired from above, her shots sharp and deliberate. Each time one of the riders tried to advance, she drove them back. The red bandana leader cursed, realizing they were trapped between the ridge and the rocks. He waved his arm, signaling the last of his men to spread out. The sun dipped lower, turning the world blood red. The wind kicked up dust that stung their eyes. The gunfire slowed as both sides paused, waiting for darkness to give them an edge. Clay's breath came hard. His arm throbbed, his hands raw from the rifle's kick. The sheriff looked pale but alert. "They won't leave," he said. "You know that." "I know," Clay said quietly. "But neither will I." He looked up toward Tessa, still holding her ground. Her figure against the fiery sky burned into his mind. The same woman who'd been chained and silent days ago, now standing free and unbreakable. Something about that sight filled him with strength he didn't think he had left. The red bandana leader stepped forward, waving a torch that threw wild light across his face. "You can't hide forever, cowboy," he shouted. "We'll smoke you out." He tossed the torch toward the mission ruins, and within seconds the dry timbers caught. Flames roared up, swallowing the doorway and crawling up the walls. The sky turned orange again, but this time with fire instead of sunset. Tessa stared down in horror. "They'll burn us alive." Clay turned to the sheriff. "Can you move?" The sheriff nodded weakly. "I'll manage. Then get to your horse and ride. Now. What about you?" Clay didn't answer. He grabbed his revolver, checked the bullets, and started down the ridge again. The flames crackled louder, sparks rising like ghosts into the dark. The riders closed in, their faces glowing in the firelight. The sheriff climbed onto his horse, bleeding but determined. He shouted one last time, "Clay, don't do this!" But Clay didn't look back. He stepped into the smoke, rifle raised, eyes locked on the red bandana leader. And as the fire reached the old cross of the mission, the sound of gunfire and thunder fused into one deafening roar, one that would decide not just who lived, but what kind of man Clay really was when the flames finally died. The fire raged across the old mission, crackling and roaring like the anger of the desert itself. The night sky glowed orange, and the smell of burning timber and gunpowder mixed thick in the air. Clay moved through the smoke, his boots crunching over broken stone. Every step was heavy, every breath filled with ash. The red bandana leader's shouts echoed between the walls, calling for his men to close in. Clay didn't wait for them to come. He met them head-on. The first man rose from behind a fallen beam, aiming his rifle. Clay fired first, the shot ringing out sharp and final. Another came charging through the haze, swinging the butt of his gun. But Clay ducked low, grabbing the man's arm and slamming him into the wall. The impact sent sparks flying. The man went still. Clay's shoulder burned from the strain, his arm still bleeding, but he pushed on. Through the flames he saw the leader moving toward him, revolver drawn, the firelight flickering off his bandana. "You should have stayed out of this, cowboy," the man growled. Clay leveled his gun, eyes steady. "Maybe I should have. But a man's got to stand for something, The two fired almost at the same time. The sound split the night in half. Clay stumbled back, his ribs burning like fire, but the bandana man dropped first, falling to his knees before collapsing into the dirt. His revolver spun out of his hand, sliding into the dust beside the dying fire. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the crackle of the burning wood. The riders who still lived looked to their leader, then to the cowboy standing tall among the flames. One by one they backed away. None spoke. None fired another shot. They mounted their horses and rode into the darkness, swallowed by the desert they had come from. Clay lowered his gun, his breath ragged. The world around him flickered with orange and red. He heard the sheriff's voice through the smoke. "Clay!" He turned to see the old lawman limping toward him, face streaked with dust and sweat. Behind him, Tessa came running down from the ridge, her shawl pulled tight against the smoke. She stopped when she saw the bodies, her eyes full of shock but not fear. "It's done," the sheriff said, coughing. "They're gone." Clay nodded weakly, swaying on his feet. "Not yet," he muttered, looking toward the flames. "The fire's spreading." The sheriff looked around, realizing the dry grass had caught. The wind was pushing the fire toward the canyon brush. "If it jumps the creek, it'll burn for miles," he said. Tessa moved quickly, grabbing a bucket near the well. She filled it, tossing water at the spreading flames. Clay joined her despite his injuries, and the sheriff followed. Together they worked through the night, throwing water, beating flames with blankets, doing whatever they could to keep the fire contained. When the last embers finally died, the mission stood half in ruin, blackened but not gone. The land smelled of smoke and sweat, and the faint sweetness of wet ash. Clay leaned against a beam, breathing hard, the night cool again after the storm. The sheriff wiped his brow and looked at him with quiet respect. "You've got a way of finding hell wherever you ride, Clay." Clay managed a tired smile. "I don't go looking for it. It just seems to find me." Tessa walked toward them, her face streaked with soot but her eyes bright. "It's over," she said softly. Clay looked at her, then at the sky just starting to pale with dawn. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe it is." The sheriff saddled his horse, wincing at the pain in his side. "Town'll be talking about this for years, but I'll tell it straight that you stood your ground." Clay nodded. "They'll still come for her. Not if I have anything to say about it," the sheriff said. He mounted up, the leather creaking. "You two head north. There's an old trail through Red Mesa. No one will follow you that far." Tessa stepped closer. "You'd risk your badge for us?" The sheriff smiled faintly. "A badge don't mean much if it ain't backed by what's right." He tipped his hat to them both. "Take care of each other." They watched him ride off, his figure fading into the soft light of morning. When he was gone, Clay turned to Tessa. She stood quiet, her hair tangled, her hands trembling slightly. The fire's reflection had faded from her eyes, replaced by something gentler, something free. He looked at the wreckage of the mission, then back at her. "Where will you go?" She gazed toward the horizon, the desert stretching wide and endless. "There's a place near the mountains. Water, good land. My people once lived there before they were taken. I'll find what's left of it. Maybe start again." He nodded, his chest heavy. "You'll need someone who knows how to work the land." She smiled faintly. "You offering?" "Maybe I am." For a moment neither spoke. The silence was calm now, no longer filled with fear. Just the sound of wind through the burned wood and a lone bird calling from somewhere above. They spent the next day gathering what they could. Food, tools, the last of the bullets. Clay's wound had begun to heal, though it still hurt when he moved too fast. Tessa stitched what she could of his sleeve, her hands gentle but sure. The quiet between them had grown easy, filled with unspoken trust. When night came, they camped near the creek. The stars burned bright again, and the air smelled clean after the fire. Clay sat by the flames, staring into them the way men do when they've survived something that changed them. Tessa sat across from him, humming softly in her native tongue. It was a song he didn't understand but didn't need to. It carried peace in it, something old and forgiving. After a while she spoke. "Back in my village there was a story about a man who found a wounded hawk. He nursed it back to health, but when it could fly again, it left without looking back. The man was angry at first, but his wife told him, 'That's how you know you did right, because it could leave.'" Clay looked at her, understanding settling in his tired eyes. "You think I'm the hawk or the man?" She smiled softly. "Maybe both." The fire popped between them, and he looked away toward the horizon. "You know," he said, voice low, I never meant to get involved. I just wanted to buy a cow. That made her laugh, a small, genuine sound that felt like the first real thing in days. And instead you got trouble, he nodded. Trouble worth fighting for. The night deepened around them, quiet and endless. In the distance, the wind carried away the last traces of smoke, leaving only stars above the desert. When Clay finally closed his eyes, he dreamed of open land, green fields, and a cabin where the air smelled of rain instead of fire. Morning came soft and golden. They packed their things and rode east following the sun. The land changed slowly. Less dust, more grass. They passed an abandoned farmhouse. Its roof half collapsed and Clay stopped. This could be it, he said quietly. A place to start over. Tessa dismounted, walking toward the house. She touched the old wood, weathered and warm under her hand. It's quiet, she said. Peaceful, Clay nodded. It needs work. But so do we. She turned to him, the sunlight catching in her eyes. You sure about this? He smiled faintly. First time in a long while, yeah. I'm sure. They began to rebuild over the next weeks, fixing fences, clearing land, bringing the old well back to life. The days were long and hard, but the silence between them was filled with purpose. Sometimes, at sunset, they'd sit on the porch they'd built together, watching the colors fade over the hills. One evening, as the sky turned violet, Tessa said softly, "Do you ever think about the ones we left behind?" Clay looked toward the horizon. Every day. But I figure the best way to honor them is to keep living. She nodded, her gaze far away. My people believe the spirits follow those who carry their fire forward. Maybe they're here now, watching. Then we best give them something worth watching, Clay said with a small grin. The wind brushed through the grass, warm and steady. Somewhere nearby, a young calf cried out from the small pen they'd built. Tessa smiled at the sound. Buy a cow, get a working Apache woman for free, she said, repeating the words that had started it all, her tone half teasing, half reflective. Clay chuckled softly. Guess that farmer didn't know what he was giving away. She looked at him, her smile fading into something gentler. Neither did you. The moment lingered there, quiet and full of everything they'd survived. As the last light faded, Clay took off his hat and looked at the sky, the stars coming out one by one. Maybe we both found more than we were looking for, he said. She nodded, her voice low. Maybe we did. The desert stretched out around them, wide and endless, but for the first time it didn't feel empty. It felt like home, and as the night settled in, two figures sat side by side on the porch of a half-built dream, the firelight flickering softly in their eyes, proof that even in a land made of dust and sorrow, something new could still begin.